Passover of the Jews was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple he found those who were selling oxen and sheep and pigeons, and the money changers sitting there. And making a whip of cords, he drove them all out of the temple with the sheep and the oxen. He poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. And he told those who sold the pigeons, "Take these things away. Do not make my Father's house a house of trade." His disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." So the Jews said to him, "What sign do you show us for doing these things?" Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." The Jews then said, "It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and will you raise it up in 3 days?" But he was speaking about the temple of his body. When therefore he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the scripture and the word that Jesus had spoken. Now when he was in Jerusalem at the Passover feast, many believed in his name when they saw the signs that he was doing. But Jesus on his part did not entrust himself to them, because he knew all people and needed no one to bear witness about man, for he himself knew what was in man.
Thank you, Andy. Good morning, people of Grace.
Good morning.
Before we begin with the message, I just want to underscore what we talked about the lunch this afternoon, right after the service, for a brief meeting for information about the Romania trip. Even if you're not sure whether you're going, or maybe even not even interested at all at this point, but maybe you might just come get some free pizza and some free information. We'd love to have you in the fellowship hall, because just hearing about it may light your fire. So I want to encourage you to join us if you'd like. There's no commitment at this level. At this point, it's just an information meeting, but we'd love to have you praying about it. And as Andy did just pray, I got a note from Donnie, our friend in Romania, just a couple of days ago, saying he had crossed over into Ukraine and is there right now. He took a lot of supplies and different things like that, but he's also speaking at a youth camp. So let's be praying for him, that God would use him and the other pastors with him and keep them safe, of course. So as we begin this morning, I have some good news and possibly some bad news to share with you first. And the same news may be good to some and bad to others. With the weather getting colder, I don't know if you're aware of this, but it's now the fall season and will soon be the winter season. And parents and kids, I want you to know that exactly 6 weeks from this morning is Christmas morning.
That's great.
Now that is great news to a lot of us, and maybe really bad news to some of us. We've got to get busy. Here in Gadsden, when Christmas rolls around, we have some traditions that most of you have participated in and have been a part of. I looked online last night to check the dates, but on Saturday morning, December 3rd, is the downtown parade, the Christmas parade. And the last time I went, it was in the evening, and I remember it being a cold evening, and the parade seemed like it lasted 3 or 4 hours. And it was wonderful, but boy, it was long. And a few years ago, they decided to go with a morning parade, but that is December 3rd coming up. There's also, this is not announcements here. I have a point at this moment. But also up on the mountain at Nakalula Falls, of course, we had the production up there with all the lights and the little train ride, and hopefully it won't crash this year, but it's a great little thing to be a part of. But I mentioned those two things because I want you to put your imagination hats on as we begin this morning. And let's think about the parade downtown. And as they're coming through, and every marching band in the state of Alabama seemed to show up the last time I was there. But and all the floats of everything in our community, and it's neat to see those kinds of things. But can you imagine if, as this parade is coming through, there's a float there for the SPCA or the Humane Society, and they've got a lot of little adopted puppies and adopted kitty cats, and maybe even some ponies or whatever that they are trying to rescue, and they want to encourage you in the audience to consider taking on an animal and taking it home for Christmas. And as you're enjoying that and pointing out, look at the cute little dog there, and they're all on little leashes and everything, all of a sudden, out of nowhere, a crazy man, crazy-looking man, comes running out toward the little animals in the parade and says, "Get these animals out of here!" And he starts taking a whip and scattering the little puppies and kitties and even ponies. Wouldn't that just ruin your Christmas parade? Wouldn't you hope that Gadsden's finest officers would grab a fellow like that and take him to a nice cell where he can settle down, and his picture would be on the front page of the paper the next day, or online you'd see a mugshot, and it would say something like this: "New preacher in town arrested for sabotaging our Christmas parade." Wouldn't that be tragic? And wouldn't it be really strange if somebody asked you, "Do you want to go listen to this new preacher in town? I think he's an interesting person." Well, as far-fetched as that little illustration suggests, the story that Andy just read, that we've heard thousands of times perhaps, and we may yawn at it because we're used to it, it doesn't shock us like it would shock us at a Christmas parade. And if somebody asked you, "Do you want to listen to this man? Do you want to spend some time with him?" most of us would say, "I am never going to go to that guy's church." And frankly, I wouldn't blame you. But that is similar to what we have in this story. There's a parade in town. Although it's not a Christmas parade, it's a Passover parade. It's not really a parade, but there are multitudes of people gathered around the festivities. And one commentator that I was reading this week talked about how Passover, the preparation for it and the feelings for it with the Jewish people, was similar to what we experience getting ready for Christmas. When they would hear that Passover is only 6 weeks away, there would be excitement and dread of all that went into it. The Jewish people, 3 times a year, were called to come to Jerusalem, especially males. Females, if they had little kids or if they were pregnant with child, they could stay home. But most people wanted to come to Jerusalem for Passover. There were 3 feasts that God laid out in the Old Testament through Moses to teach his people by bringing them together to worship in Jerusalem. These 3 feasts were times of celebration and times of worship. One was Pentecost, which was a harvest feast and a celebration of God's provision for them. One was the Feast of Booths, or Tabernacles, as it was sometimes called, where they would actually live in little tents. And Jewish people still do this today. They live in little huts in New York City on the backs of their apartments. They build little huts that remind them of the days of living and traveling through the wilderness for 40 years. But then there's also Passover. And Passover was the most special of all. It was God's tool to teach your children and your family about the story of redemption. The animals would be slain to picture and remind them, but also in present tense, to have their sins covered by the blood of the Lamb. And fathers would tell their children at Passover supper the story of God rescuing his people from Egypt through the blood of the Lamb, when the angel of death passed over those who had the blood on their doorpost. Passover had this deep theological meaning, of course, but it was also a time of celebration. Many of the families, as we mentioned a couple of weeks ago, up in Galilee, by the Sea of Galilee, traveled about 100 miles to come to Jerusalem. It was quite a commitment. As I said, it would be like us walking to Tuscaloosa. But they would do that 3 times a year. But Passover especially was this special gathering. But it was especially fun to travel with your relatives, your aunts, your uncles, your cousins. You remember the story where Joseph and Mary lose Jesus in the chaos of one of those trips when he is at the temple. And it says specifically that they are with friends and others and didn't realize they lost him. How do you lose the Son of God? And we could accuse them of that, but part of that picture is a reminder of what happened at this event. In the middle of this event is this story that we call the cleansing of the temple, or Jesus emptying the temple, as Andy read to us. So as we look at the book of John, where we've been, this sermon series called That You May Believe. Last week we talked about how Jesus shows up at a wedding in chapter 2 of John, in the little town of Cana of Galilee. And we talked about how Jesus shows us in transforming water into wine, how he came to transform our lives for our good and for his glory. We talked about how John talks about how this miracle is one of the first of 7 signs, as he calls them. Signs are miracles that point ahead to something significant or significant, we might say. These are special miracles that point to Jesus, but also to a theological reminder of what Jesus came for. And this one shows us this, he says in chapter 2, verse 11, this is the first of his signs, when he made the water into wine. Jesus did this first of his signs at Cana in Galilee and manifested his glory. And his disciples believed in him. So that's where we were last week. But this week, right after that story, is the story that Andy read to us of Jesus interrupting the scene at Passover. One other thing that I need to remind you and to mention about this is Passover in Jerusalem was so popular and so incredible that scholars estimate that over 2.25 million people traveled and came inside the walls of Jerusalem during that period. 2.25 million people gathering inside Jerusalem every year. I say that because people were packed in, and it was like a pressure cooker in that setting. In that setting, we have this story break out. Why do we hear this story from John at this point of his book? We mentioned the last couple weeks that John is introducing Jesus to us. He does that in the prologue that we spent some time in, which the first 18 verses is a beautiful poem full of theological reminders that Jesus is not just a man. He was in the beginning with God, and he was God. And he created all things. Nothing was made that was not made by him. And it goes on and on and on. And then we start meeting characters, these disciples, starting with John the Baptizer, and then these disciples who meet him. And we find out a little bit more about him as we inch into the story. So last week, we see this first sign. And right after this sign, this story of joy, this story of celebration, is this story of justice and a story of chaos. Jesus was bringing joy and celebration last week, but this week he is bringing anger. He is good and angry. That's the sermon title for this week. Jesus, good and angry. The interesting thing, too, is where John puts this story in his gospel. Did you know that there possibly, maybe probably, were 2 times that he did this? You see, when you read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they talk about Jesus cleansing the temple, very similar to this, at the end, the last week of his life. But John tells us about 3 Passovers. They only mention the last one, the week of Jesus' death, when he will die as the Passover lamb. And right before that is when he rides in on the donkey on what we call Palm Sunday, and then he cleanses the temple. But John tells us this up front, which means either that he moved it up, ignored the chronology just so he could make a point. Some scholars believe he did that. It doesn't deny inspiration at all. Sometimes in a story, even a biography, you may read something that's out of order chronologically if the author is trying to make a point about somebody's life. So that may be what John's doing. Or, and I believe it's more likely that Jesus did this twice. Because let's face it, when he did it the first time, they got upset, but nothing changed. And when he came back a couple more Passovers, he saw the same scene. So who is this person who would look like some kind of radical zealot, who is just a little unhinged? Why does John want us to see this? We just sang that beautiful song that Emmy wrote about his name is kindness. And we love the stories of him making water into wine and bringing joy and comfort to us. But this story says he came to stir things up. He is kind. He is gentle. I am meek and lowly, he says in Matthew 11. But he is also righteous and holy and uncomfortable, as we'll see in this story. So, this morning we're going to see three pictures of Jesus in this little episode. We're going to see first Jesus, the angry zealot, as we just described. And then we're going to see, right after that, Jesus, let me see if I can get that to come up here. Jesus, the new temple. That's a second picture we'll see. And then we'll see a third picture, Jesus, the all-knowing judge. All of that is in what Andy read to us a few moments ago. The main idea that we'll look at this morning is this. Jesus gets good and angry when religious people forget who and what worship is about. Jesus gets good and angry when religious people forget who and what worship is really about. When we talk about Jesus getting angry, it brings up some questions. First of all, isn't anger sin? When our kids get angry at each other or at us, don't we make them sit in timeout or punish them some way for what seems to be a sin of selfishness on their part? When a player or a coach gets angry in a game, they are liable to get penalized for not playing the game right. So isn't Jesus out of line here, going over the top? That's one of the questions that comes up. Another question that comes up is, well, if Jesus seems to have a temper, maybe I'm not so bad after all with my temper. I just kind of identify with Jesus when I get angry. But that's the reason the title is Jesus is good and angry. He has righteous indignation. Many times we think we have righteous indignation. But a third party can often look at us and say, it's not as righteous as you think it is. Being angry is not the problem. Jesus did get angry. He gets angry here. In Mark chapter 3, we read a story about him in the synagogue on the Sabbath day, seeing a man sitting there who had a withered hand. He had gone through all of his life with this, and it says the Pharisees were looking at him to see if he would heal him on the Sabbath so that they could accuse him. And Mark tells us that he looked at them with anger and said, is it right to do good on the Sabbath or to do evil? Is it right to heal and to give life or to give death? Because they're ready to kill him on the Sabbath or not. Jesus is angry at their hypocrisy. We see him in anger call Herod a fox, call the Pharisees whited sepulchres or tombstones, and like John the Baptist, called them a brood of snakes. He got angry, but he got angry at the right things. And we'll see in a moment what he's angry about. He is this angry zealot. Now, he's not the kind of zealot that many of the Jewish people were, where they wanted to take it to the streets against Roman occupation. Jesus doesn't go there, because that's not the right thing to be angry at. He is not a revolutionary. He has the opportunity to do that, like Barabbas, who's chosen instead of him to be set free. But Jesus ignores all the political stuff. He says, I didn't come here to overthrow Caesar. My kingdom is not of this world. So that's not what he's angry at. And in this chapter here, he's not even angry about the animals being sold. You see, When people traveled 100 miles, or several miles in other cases, they couldn't bring their animals. So it was a provision made where the animals would be sold when they reached Jerusalem. And they would critique the animals, make sure they were without blemish and spotless and could be sacrificed according to Old Testament law. So that was all legitimate. Jesus wasn't mad about that, but he was good and angry about how they did it. Here's the words that Andy read to us that the disciples remembered later. This is why he was angry at the right thing. His disciples remembered later that it was written, and this is from Psalm 69, verse 9. And later on they put it together. This is what David was talking about. He was pointing ahead to Jesus, who would say, the zeal for your house, my Father's house, has consumed me. And the word consumed me, it has eaten me alive. So when Jesus is a zealot, he's not a political zealot. He's not angry at the wrong things, but he is angry at some very real things that were real problems there, and they are also real problems for us, especially when it comes to religion. The zeal for his Father's house, for doing worship right, understanding who it's about and what it's about, eats him up. So what is he angry about? First of all, he's angry about the hypocrisy. All through this story are these people who are serving at the temple. And in their minds, they think they're doing God's will. They're providing these sacrificial animals. It's part of the system. It's what has to happen. And so they set up shop. But it's full of hypocrisy because it's handled in a way that is not according to the ways of worship that God has laid out. They are hypocritical in what they are doing and the way they are doing it. I'll just skip on to the next one because this is related. Jesus also is very upset and hates greed. In the story here, it talks about the money changers, those who had the animals, but also this specific term for the people who were in charge of changing the money. As pilgrims came in from all over Israel, these 2 million pilgrims came in with coinage from all different areas. And so when they got to Jerusalem, they had to pay the coinage in the local currency, or it would have been very confusing. So again, it's part of the system. But it's very specific that they were greedy, and these money changers, according to the scholars of the day, according to Jewish records, were known for jacking it up, for raising the rates, for making the rates different for different people. It was all in their hands. They were like shop owners on the streets of Jerusalem. It was just another day in the office. And Jesus hated it. He got angry and zealous about it. Do not do that in my Father's house. You get these animals and this money out of here, and he turns the tables, flips the tables, and the money goes everywhere. Why is he so over the top? Because he hates hypocrisy. He hates greed. And it doesn't just happen 2,000 years ago. Churches and religions are full of hypocrisy and greed, aren't they? It's easy for us to justify things we do. Not only is he hateful of those kinds of things. He's also hateful of the abuse of others. One of the things that's interesting in this story is something that doesn't always show up when you're first reading it. As he makes this whip of cords, it says in verse 15, he drives them out of the temple with the sheep and oxen. He pours out the coins, overturns the tables. And then he says, take these things away. Do not make my Father's house a house of trade. Part of the reason that he's so upset is not only what is going on with the selling, but also where it's happening. It says that this in the temple in verse 14, the word temple there is a special word, not for the temple building, but for the area around the building. If you look at this slide, this is a picture of a model of Herod's temple there that he built for the Jewish people. And around the perimeter, you can see at the bottom it says Court of the Gentiles. And up at the top, on that side, the Court of the Gentiles. This is where shop was set up to sell these animals. The Court of the Gentiles. You say, what's the point? The point is, as most of us know, that surfaced area there was the closest that the Gentiles could get to the temple to worship God. This was provided for them even if they weren't Jewish, even if they hadn't converted to Judaism and undergone circumcision. They could come here and participate in worship from the outside until the pawn shops and the flea market business started there. Somebody made the decision, and scholars feel like it was Annas, the high priest, to take it out of the streets and bring it into the temple area. And when that decision came up, they said, where would we do it? Well, of course, the court of the Gentiles. Who cares about them? The dogs, the goyim. They don't want to worship our God anyway. Let's set up shop there and make it convenient. And that is one of the things that really sets Jesus off. Because his house, his Father's house, is to be a place for all nations. But the Jewish people, like us, have their own tribe and don't want others to be involved many times. So Jesus is upset about the hypocrisy. He's upset about the greed. He's also upset, really upset about the abuse to the Gentiles. But here's the other thing that underscores the whole situation. Jesus hates irreverence and dead religion. This whole thing had become a ritual. There was a lot of joy in seeing all your friends. There was a lot of talking back and forth as people were hanging out at the flea market there. But it was cold, dead religion. They forgot that's what they were selling the animals for. It was all a routine they went through. It's the same thing Isaiah warned them about 700 years earlier, and really every prophet. But this is right at the beginning of Isaiah's 66th chapter book. Speaking through Isaiah, God says, when you come to appear before me, who has required of you this trampling of my courts? Who's twisting your arm to make you go through this ritual process as you approach it? Bring me no more vain offerings. Incense is an abomination to me. God was the one who told them to bring incense, to model the prayers that were lifted to him. But he says, I don't need that. Because you're not really praying. It's just ritual. It's just cold, dead religion, as it always seems to turn into this. New moon and Sabbath, the calling of convocation, which is what these feasts were. I cannot endure iniquity and solemn assembly. These two things don't go together. This is God talking. Your new moons and your appointed feast, my soul hates. I mean, this is strong language. All these people are, it's Passover time. We get to hang out with Aunt Judy and Uncle George and all the cousins, and let's go. And by the way, we're going to offer a sacrifice while we're there too. And God says, I hate this. They have become a burden to me. I am weary of bearing them. Can you imagine this? And isn't it easy to look back at them and say, shame on you, ritualistic, boring people, bored with the feast of God. But can we apply that to ourselves? Do we come in irreverence? Is our religion dead? Are we bored? Do we just go through the motions? And I'm afraid we'd have to say, yes, we are guilty of that as well. So this story is a historical story, but it's got practical applications all the way through it. Religion just has a tendency to just become routine, and we get way too used to it. And God says to us and to them, do you really have to come trample on my carpet? I don't get anything out of this if your heart's not in it. Now I want to preach grace. We're Grace Bible Church. But this is what gets Jesus good and angry. He is gentle. He loves us. But he also calls us to remember what it's about. Jesus is zealous about it being the right thing. Well, let's run ahead to the next picture. Jesus is also pictured here as the new temple. Now that sounds a little strange. How can a man in flesh and blood be the new temple? But notice what happens in verse 18. When Jesus upsets this party, the Jews said to him, what sign do you show us for doing these things? Notice they don't say, what are you doing? They say to him, they seem to know this crazy man apparently, maybe like one of the Old Testament prophets. They did a lot of crazy things to get people's attention too. And so they say, you must be somebody who think you're somebody, so you better have a sign from God that shows us who you are. Who gives you this kind of authority? And Jesus has a strange answer for them. Since they're upset that he has upset the temple, he says, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. Now again, you and I have heard this story hundreds of times perhaps. So we shrug our shoulders and we say, oh, we know he's talking about his body. But we wouldn't have known that then. They didn't know it. What a strange thing to say. You want a sign? Destroy this temple and I'll raise it in 3 days. And as we'll see as we go through the Gospel of John, people always take Jesus literally when he's talking about spiritual things. And this one is, again, to their credit, I think all of us would have taken that literally, and they get upset. And they say in verse 20, it has taken 46 years to build this temple, and will you raise it up in 3 days? And then John gives us a little parenthesis in verse 21 and whispers in our ear, just in case we haven't heard this 100 times. But he was speaking about the temple of his body. He's the new temple. But let's talk real quickly about the big temple there. They say this temple has been 46 years in the making, in the building. This temple from Herod, King Herod, built this magnificent temple. The Jewish people hated King Herod. And he did this in order to win their confidence. The temple had been destroyed back in the Old Testament because the people were in irreverent, boring religion, and God allows them to be carried off by the Babylonians, and they destroy the temple. Well, Herod began to build it back, and it had been 46 years in the making when this happened. It was finished a few years later, in 63 AD. And then it was destroyed again by the Romans 7 years later. But this temple was magnificent. It would have been one of the 7 wonders of the world if it had been built during that time. But it was fabulous. And the Jewish people loved the temple, even though they got bored with the ceremonies. It was a special place. It was a special place because this is where you met God. But John tells us in chapter 1, in that prologue, that there's this person called the Word, who was with God in the beginning and is God, who became flesh, and he dwelt among us. And the word that John uses there is the word for he pitched his tent. He tabernacled among us, like in the Old Testament, when they carried the tabernacle and set it up and put the Ark of the Covenant in there as they traveled. That was the presence of God in their midst. And John says, there's a new person in our midst. And he's the Word who was with God and is God. And he is the new temple. We have seen his glory, glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. So when Jesus says this, tear down this temple and I will build it back, I will raise it up in 3 days. He's talking about this temple and he's saying, I'm going to give you the sign you're looking for. And I hope you recognize it when you see it. He's the place to meet God himself. The New Testament develops this further. We're in the early stages of it in John 1. We get this picture, this foggy picture of this one called the Word, who is now tabernacling among us. But he is the place to meet God. In the Old Testament, the Jewish people, to show how much they loved the temple. This is a beautiful psalm from Psalm 84. And this is when they're getting it right. And the psalmist is saying, I love to go to your dwelling place. How lovely is your dwelling place, O Lord of hosts. My soul so longs, yes, it faints for the courts of the Lord. I love to go amongst God's people and be there. My heart and flesh sing for joy to the living God. And then this is fascinating. David says, even the sparrow. Maybe one day when he's sitting there at the temple, he sees a little sparrow up in the crevice of the stone there, building a nest. Even the sparrow finds a home here. And the swallow, a nest for herself. where she may lay her young at your altars, O Lord of hosts. It's like these little birds know this is the best place on earth to be. I'm going to build a nest here. And David's saying, I wish I could build a nest and just stay here, worship God. Blessed are those who dwell in your house, ever singing your praise. Then in verse 10, it says, for a day in your courts is better than 1,000 elsewhere. I would rather be a doorkeeper in the house of my God than to dwell in the tents of wickedness. That's the picture that we should have of a place to meet with God. But in the New Testament, Jesus says, it's not a building anymore. It's me. The book of Hebrews brings this out and says, therefore, brothers, since we have confidence to enter the holy places by the blood of Jesus, by the new and living way that he opened for us through the curtain, that is, through his flesh, let us draw near. We can come near to God now with a true heart and full assurance of faith. Jesus is the way to God. He is also the place of glory. In 1 Kings 8, when Solomon built the original temple, it says that on the day of dedication, the priest came in and a cloud filled the house of the Lord so that the priest could not stand to minister because of the cloud. It's the Shekinah glory that came down, and all of the priests had to leave because the glory of God, representing his presence there, was overwhelming. They said, for the glory of the Lord filled the house of the Lord. Well, John comes back in John 1:14, what we just read, and says, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory, the glory as of the only Son from the Father. He is that presence of God that is overwhelming in flesh and blood amongst us. On that miracle of making water into wine, John just slides this in there. We may have read right past it, but it says, when he did that, he manifested or put on display his glory. When they're looking at these stone pots that were full of water and now they're full of the best wine, they're going, what happened? The glory of God's presence was among them. The temple is also a place of holiness. We read these stories, and I won't read it here for the sake of time, but Aaron's sons are messing around in the temple, and they offer some kind of strange fire, it says, and God exterminates them. Nadab and Abihu, the next in line for the priesthood. And God sends a message to his people. You don't mess around with me. You don't come into the temple with full assurance like we just read in Hebrews on your own. You can only come through the blood of the one who is the Word. Hebrews tells us, for it was indeed fitting that we should have a high priest like Jesus, who is holy, he's innocent, unstained, separated from sinners, and exalted above the heavens. He's the one that can let us in to this holy place. He has no need, like other priests, to offer sacrifices daily, first for their own sins and then for those of the people, because he did this once for all when he offered up himself. He is the way to God. Now, quickly, let me just point out this last picture. Jesus, the all-knowing judge. Look in your Bibles, if you have them open. If not, just listen to this as I read this. In verse 23, it says, now, when he was in Jerusalem at the Passover feast, many believed in his name when they saw the signs that he was doing. Now, notice verse 24. But Jesus, on his part, did not not entrust himself to them because he knew all people and needed no one to bear witness about mankind, for he himself knew what was in man. What a strange way to end this story. John is called the Gospel of Belief. And all the way through here, we're going to see you need to believe on the Son to have life. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes on him will have eternal life. Well, here it says that these people believed on Jesus in his name when they saw the signs, they saw the miracles, they saw this event happen. But Jesus, on his part, did not entrust himself to them. And ironically, in the Greek language, that word did not entrust is the word believe. They believed on Jesus, but Jesus didn't believe in them. This is what we call the problem of incomplete belief. This is a scary thing that happens in Jerusalem. And it's a scary thing that happens in the Bible Belt, especially of America. These people see a miracle and somehow have a surface belief, but it's not true belief. And Jesus says, I am the one who knows all men and women and know their hearts. He says in Matthew 25 that there's coming a day when there are people who are going to say, Lord, have I not done all these things in your name? And I'm going to say to them, depart from me, I never knew you. That is the scariest verse, I think, in the Bible. And it's tied to this here, where Jesus, the all-knowing judge, knows when somebody truly has believed and had new life started in them. But a lot of other people have this surface belief where they pray a little prayer and then go on and do what they want, and nothing changes in their life. And John ends this story by saying, these are some scary pictures of Jesus. He's a zealot about real religion that's from the heart. He is passionate about, he is the new temple. And he is also all-knowing about where our hearts are. This is not as cheery and wonderful as last week's lesson about the water turning into wine. Jesus comes to transform us. But he also comes to challenge us and say, where is your heart? John is saying, I'm putting this story at the front because I want you to deal with the gracious, kind Jesus, but I also want you to deal with this Jesus who is the all-knowing judge who knows our hearts. This passage introduces the rest of the book. As we start next week with a man by the name of Nicodemus, who is very religious. But Jesus says, Nick, you need to be born again. You need to have a whole new way of living. And it starts with believing from your heart in me. So as we pray, I encourage you to just say, Lord, examine my heart. Is my belief truly in you? Have I anchored my life on you? Am I riding through this with you? Or am I just kind of hoping I'll make it? Is my belief concrete in you? Let's pray. Father, these pictures Son, who's so wonderful and gracious, but also frightening in his anger toward our hypocrisy, toward the way we can be by means of our human nature, but also just putting the spotlight on our heart and saying, follow me. I pray that we will not be scared away from him, but we will realize that he is serious about the decision we make to come to him. He is meek and lowly. He loves us as his own. But Lord, I do pray that we will do business with you in our home.